looking at my mother and father's life, I think one has to look from where does someone stem from where does someone come from, and then it helps us better to understand the type of person that we're talking about.
Born in Dukla, a small town in Poland, he learned all his learning by my father's grandfather, who was a Gonailam, who was known as one of the Gedailim in Galicia.
I was blessed to be able to go with my parents back to my father's shtetl in Dukla. And I will never forget how my father pointed to the balcony where his Zayda lived. And my father said, Leia gedenk, du hab ich gelernt mein ganze Torah. Here's where I learned my whole Torah.
Spoke primarily about his grandfather. Him and Rabbi Hirschprung on a lower level were the two central figures in his life. He escaped to Vilna at the beginning of the war. He met Reb Chaim Meiser and a lot of other Litvische Gedailim. He tried to run Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin there. He was very concerned about the refugees. He did everything possible to help out people.
The biggest maven was Reb Meir Shapiro on my father. He said, "So doch gelernt to build Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin for two Talmidim, and one of them is my father, Reb Pinchas von Dikla."
While he was running away from Hitler, he says, "If I survive the war, I'll dedicate my whole life to Torah." From there he went to Japan, and he went on the last boat before Pearl Harbor to America. My father came alone. His grandmother died before. His grandmother and his grandfather and his parents and his sisters were all killed.
My mother was born in Montreal in the early 1920s. It was a midbirth, it was like a desert. There was no Yiddishkeit. I remember my mother always saying that after public school she would go to a Melamed in the afternoon.
My mother's father was a sheikhet, lived in Montreal. My father took a job in the Vati was very young, in his 20s. They gave him a rabbanis in the Vati.
Rabbi Hirschprung came to lead the Gedat Yeshurun synagogue on St. Irvin Street. And if he spoke, Saturday afternoon or Monday night, the people were there. He could speak verbatim. It came to him naturally. He could explain it in a way that when you left, you knew everything.
My mother, she used to come to my father's shiur, and my father used to always want to know who's that woman with the black hair. My father did not want, since his parents were killed, he did not want a big wedding. And he did not want my mother to wear a gown at the wedding. Because he says, I suffered so much, my parents will not be at the wedding. And my mother, to her credit, didn't even question it and accepted it immediately.
What resonates most for me about my mother is how much she cared about other people and about their stories, and how she was so concerned for other people. And that made her so endearing, not just to us, but to everyone else.
My mother lost her father when she was very young, and she went through the Holocaust, through terrible times. After the war was over and she was in the refugee camp, Rabbi Hirschprung sponsored my mother. He was a newlywed, maybe married a year. Mrs. Hirschprung, who was a Canadian, my mother didn't even speak a word of English, and he brought her to the house and made her feel 100% that she belonged there, and she lived with them, and she was so part of the family.
A house is just a house, and what made our small 230 Curbs a home was the people in it and the openness it had. Our home was incredibly open for just about everybody, so the size really wasn't even an issue. It didn't stop my mother from having a grandfather, a cousin. It's the energy and the spirit you have in your home, and the energy and spirit was so big that it really allowed everybody to fit into the home.
I think we were raised in a family where chesed was the greatest thing that we were taught. Even though being, let's say, a good student is a very important thing, but the greatest thing was, are you a mensch? You have to be a mensch.
He spoke once in Mizrahi and he said, I'm a Gouda, you're Mizrahi. The Torah doesn't belong to either one of us. The Torah belongs to Klal Yisrael. Let's learn.
I tell you, before you even said hello to him, he had an effect on you. His mannerisms, the way he talked, he never pushed. He never tried to be a world speaker. It was all from the heart.
His heart, you know, cardiologists would have a good time trying to figure out that heart because he was all heart.
And helping people out on a personal level, not only at Sibur, every individual was to him important, and he was so sensitive to people's concerns.
He never wanted things for himself. He wanted it for other people. We did a lot of work together, and it was impossible, for me, it was impossible to say no to him, anything he wanted.
The Torah is called Nesivasei Shalom. The whole thing is Shalom. I think in a very simplistic level, that was really his thing. He was totally accepting of all different groups.
My father was incredibly who he was. He really was who he was, and I think that's why people loved him, because they saw him as human as anybody else. And he celebrated that in people, and he allowed people to be who they were. And that's the biggest gift you can give to people. It's being honest.
They called up my father that they were going under, and my father said the school should remain, and he took it over. And my sister said they didn't even have a desk, and my father took a desk from his house and brought it into the school.
I had to go from one building to another building. Who do I see on the street walking? My father with Mr. Abe Bronfman. There were a lot of people that helped my father along the way.
And I then first met Rav Hirschprung when I was being interviewed. And I got a feel of his philosophy of what Beis Yaakov is all about. The first thing that he told me is that it's from Or Echad, children that come from a milieu that is the same. To him, the same meant Shomrei Shabbos.
I went to Beis Yaakov all my life. Of course, to my mother, it was Rabbi Hirschprung school. There was not even a question of where I would go. And my parents didn't have any money. My mother, fresh immigrants, both of them.
He used to tell me, I would like a girl from Outremont and a girl from Côte St. Luc to live b'shalom together and to see each other and to learn from each other.
And later on in life, it's a tolerance and accepting of one another, that was one of his proudest things in the school.
If a Jew came to him and asked him for help, any sort of help whatsoever, from Parnasa to Shalom Bayis to any kind of a problem, he would drop his learning and he would help him. That's when he was asked. But Beis Yaakov, he wasn't asked for. Beis Yaakov, he went himself and he stopped his learning and to build a school for girls.
My father loved everyone, but a Beis Yaakov girl, there was a special place in his heart.
The graduation and the Beis Yaakov dinner was to REBBETZIN Hirschprung very important. Why? Because it was very important to her husband. Her husband enjoyed coming to a graduation and seeing the fruits of his labor.
Whatever my father was able to do in Beis Yaakov was only because my mother enabled my father to do it.
Being a chief rabbi and everything that he took care of had a lot of stress. A yeshiva, a community, there was so much. The The phone was always ringing, and my father's line, we never were allowed to use it. My mother, likewise, was a very, very busy person doing everything else. But there was such calmness in the house.
To live that kind of a life, you have to have a REBBETZIN to take care of such a Godel b'Yisrael. And she did. And she loved it. She enjoyed it.
And my mother said, "Do you want to know what my 50 years with Daddy was like, being married to Daddy?" My mother said I could sum it up in 1 or 2 minutes. And she said, being married to Daddy was like being a kala my whole life.